dear friend of 30 years recently pulled me aside with a question that begs for clarity. She's been listening to our podcast and she asked, "Are you saying everything is okay?" She wasn't talking about a bad day at the office. She was talking about the Holocaust. She was talking about the deepest traumas of the human experience. If we believe in equilibrium, are we just making excuses for suffering? Today, we're moving past the easy answers to find out if life is actually balanced or if we're just telling ourselves stories to try to make sense of things. It's the ultimate hurdle. How do we find rhyme and reason without dismissing real world pain? How do we become conscious human beings in an unconscious world? That's the mystery that we're untangling today. Welcome to Becoming You, the Path to Consciousness, where we apply spiritual principles and wisdom to your everyday life. I'm Terry Hasty.
And I'm Haydn Hasty, and today we're going to respond to the question, are you really saying that everything is okay? Is everything that happens happening for a reason? We're not going to stick with the traditional superficial responses to essentially bearing the unbearable. We're going to address these questions really from a spiritual understanding and not just a mental one. So we want to examine the cause of suffering and pain and violence and not just talk about the symptoms and current events.
Right, it's so easy to do that, but we want to really take a deep dive into it. When Hayden and I started our leadership development firm over 30 years ago, we have had the opportunity to work with so many people. It's really been a symbiotic relationship where people share the stories of their life, their traumas, their difficulties, and really no one escapes hardships. And there's some similarities between the hardships, but what this work and these relationships have really helped me see and understand are the invisible dynamics that we all encounter and how they then manifest in our lives and in our relationships, even in our bodies. And Hayden, if you're okay with that, I thought I'd start with a story about these invisible dynamics.
Sure.
Okay. So I was working with an individual. She was on medical leave from work because of extreme stress that she said was created by a hostile work environment, primarily because of her boss. And when her employer asked me to work with her, she very gratefully agreed because she said, honestly, I'm at the end of my rope. I'm going to be disabled. I can't even go back to work feeling the way that I do and dealing with things the way that I deal with them. So she came here to Asheville for a 3-day individual coaching session. She's really a lovely person, and she was genuinely struggling mentally, emotionally, physically. And we were talking about what kind of triggered her breakdown where she had to leave work. And what happened was, and as you hear this, you'll probably be reminded of times in your life when things like this happen. She had her performance review meeting at 1:00, so she was there outside her boss's door waiting, and somebody stopped by and said he just needed to ask her boss a quick question, and her boss said, "Sure, come in." So she was already upset about that. That was so disrespectful. And she said he always did stuff like that. He didn't value her, and the quick question turned into 10 minutes or maybe 15. So by the time she got in the office, she was already in a bad place, and she was kind of I guess, braced for bad news, but also feeling very negatively towards him. And she said, as we talked, that her chest tightened, her jaw clenched. She even felt her hands clenching a little bit. She started to feel lightheaded, and she was having a hard time even hearing what he was saying. And then she said these magic words. She said, "I felt like I was being choked." And I could see while she was telling me the story that she was actually in the experience, even though she was right there in the room with me, that she felt herself being choked, and her upset really didn't match the event that she was describing of this feedback conversation with her boss. So I asked her, "Have you ever been choked?" And she paused for just a second and said, "Yes, that's what my stepfather did when he was angry with me." And here we are at the intersection of self-awareness and consciousness. Self-awareness describes and explains. I mean, she realized in that conversation it wasn't her boss, but was a projection of those past traumas inflicted by her stepfather, but just knowing that's not gonna keep it from happening again. We can be aware of why it's happening, but still feel victimized by it. So over the next couple of days, she did come to see that her boss served a really important role in her evolution because he was helping her not only revisit this trauma that had kept her trapped for so many years, but it helped her move beyond the fear and the feelings of just being a child under threat.
Well, seeing the purpose begins to eliminate your attachment to the damage and helps you change your identity of who you consider yourself to be. But that can be, that can be really hard to come to terms with. What is the purpose of being choked, for example?
Hmm.
Identity here is a very important piece of solving the puzzle of this issue of everything being okay and bearing the unbearable, dealing with really difficult circumstances. But the events and traumas of a person's childhood, and I know a great deal about this, create a false identity. And then through our life experiences and consciousness, we finally come to see the truth of who we are and why we're here, if we're lucky enough to be able to receive that kind of instruction.
And that shift in identity, it's so important what you just said, Hayden, because that shift doesn't happen like in a single aha moment. We can get a glimmer, but the change doesn't occur in that single moment. It takes practice. And that's why Hayden and I facilitate our monthly online community, the Becoming You Journey. And we meet once a month because we know that staying centered in your true identity while life is throwing curveballs at you or feedback is difficult work, and it's a space where we take these deep principles in our Becoming You journey, um, and we apply them to the real-time challenges that our members are facing. It's really a chance to move from self-awareness of just explaining the problem to consciousness, which transforms it.
Well, for example, the root cause really of all the chaos you see in the world today is the fact that we are evolving and at an accelerated pace that cannot be denied. The movement from self awareness to consciousness that you essentially just mentioned has begun. And having a community or being connected to others who are part of this unfolding can be really helpful. So I hope you'll join us at becomingyoujourney.com.
So the woman I was working with moved from feeling threatened by every little thing, like having her meeting with her boss start a few minutes late, to realizing that is not the case at all. This increases our inner strength and our identity at an entirely different level. You're not who you think you are. As a matter of fact, you are unthreatenable. And I know that that's quite a leap, but if you could approach the circumstances like feedback from the perception, the reality that you are unthreatenable, what happens to the feeling of being choked? So here's a quote that I love, and I know I shared it last time, but I think it's worth sharing again, and it comes from the mother. At times you have made fine plans, and if you had succeeded, you would have been more and more encrusted in your outer ignorance, your stupid little ambition, and your aimless activity. Whilst if you receive a good shock and the post you coveted is denied to you, the plan you made is shattered, and you find yourself completely thwarted, then sometimes this opposition opens to you a door to something truer and deeper. And that's actually the evolution that Hayden was just talking about.
Well, this issue of the duality of existence, life and death, up and down, good and bad, stability, instability of a million different kinds. For me, it was such a profound dynamic that really even deeply influenced my life when I was really young. And I know that it's been the same for all human beings. When I was young, I'm looking out at the world and I just could not reconcile the obvious, although I didn't have the words for it at the time that I have now, that life for most people was hard. And that all of the promises of the God that I worshiped in the Episcopal Church and the beauty and the joy of heaven was, as far as I was concerned, a lie. Because all I saw was suffering. All I saw was difficulty and strain, and the riches and the fortunes belonged only to a few that apparently,
You weren't one of.
I wasn't part of that. And, it, it was like it was a roll of the dice. It's a matter of getting lucky. And of course, it would take many years to realize what the truth was, which is the world is an unstable equilibrium, but it is unfolding as it is supposed to. So it's a great question to, kind of start this very deep conversation off with: is suffering a necessity? And the question has to be answered: is that what we're here for? Is that what life is all about?
And when
So
you said unstable equilibrium, it made me think of the, hidden forces of life, that there are things going on that we don't see, and that's always the case. Sometimes you think, "Oh, I'm never going to get another job," for example, and all the time for months, there were things in the works to get you this other job. There are other things happening that we don't see.
Well, that's what we have to master if you're going to figure out how to override or transcend suffering. Even though life is full of difficulties, but it doesn't mean that we have to succumb to them. Coming to terms with why suffering existed at all would become, as I got older, for me, a real goal of mine, because I felt like if human cruelty, which is being practiced today as much as it was 75 years ago when I was born, and that suffering was nothing more than a tool of God to test your soul, or if God was punishing you for your sins, then how could this be resolved, and who would want to be part of this? And then under those circumstances, there would be no chance at all of understanding life. Now,
Or we would just stay in the emotional, the vital of feeling sad or feeling sorry for
well,
other
you stay
people.
in the cage. You
Mhm.
stay within the prison of the mind. Now, there's certainly not lesser problems and difficulties of the individual, the particular sufferings of the individual. But then, as we're witness to today, there are the global issues too. It's like, well, I didn't have anything to do with this, and yet I am part of this.
And it can become so overwhelming to watch and to see and just to know what's happening to so many people around the world. So, what is its place? What is the purpose of this pain, of this loss? And why does everything and everybody die? I remember we were having lunch with our friend Travis, and he shared that when he was about 10 years old, he recognized this truth that everything and everybody dies. And he said he was looking around at the adults in his life saying, "Why is nobody talking about this?" He said, "Shouldn't we be concerned? Shouldn't we come up
Has
with a
anybody noticed that?
shouldn't we come up with a plan?" So and we don't,
Yeah,
we
I thought
don't
that was a great
explore it.
story.
Yeah. So again, if everyone and everything dies and the unexpected and the unjust is just the common ground, of everyday life, then how can we ever learn to bear the unbearable beyond just the be stoic or keep your head down or the storm will pass, those platitudes that we grow up with?
Well, there's no need in the conversation becoming endarkened, because that actually is not the truth of the reality that is taking place. But there's also no need to be naive. There's so much darkness, and because of that, there is the need to have the courage to confront the darkness so that it can be mastered. But if you don't understand the role of the darkness, then you just, you really are just part of that duality and resistance to the darkness that is never going to solve it. So what you don't understand ends up owning you. And that's
Man.
a fact.
I've had that experience so many
We
times, and
all
instead
have.
of trying to understand it, I just keep being owned, or I keep being upregulated, and I think that's the source of overwhelm that we all feel at times. We just get caught in it, like in a tornado, and whatever is happening that appears to be out of my control creates overwhelm, and then it owns me. So Hayden, what is the origin of cruelty then? What is the origin? And I love that there's an answer to this. What is the origin of suffering?
The origin of cruelty, of suffering, is ignorance. And what is ignorance? Ignorance is the absence of truth. And what is the
Mm.
absence of truth? Well, in this case, the origin of suffering is essentially separation. Separation from your true self and being caught and defined by your ego. And it's this ignorance, this lack of understanding of existence itself, of who we are, that causes people to conquer and enslave and bomb and kill and maim and slaughter in the name of the principles and truth that they have come up with. And of course, there are a million other forms of harm that feels no pity for other people. We are witness to it today.
But sometimes, I mean, I have my ignorance and my separation. I don't do the things that you just said, being hurtful and
That's
violent.
the collective result of individuals doing it at
Oh,
an
yeah.
individual level.
And
I mean,
sometimes we're the recipient of someone else's
well,
ignorance.
you have to face the fact. I would like to think that this, of course, occurred when I was, very young, but we have hurt other people and other people have hurt us. So you have to be
Mhm.
honest with yourself about this. And no matter how you look at it, the issue of death and pain and suffering is a reality of the evolutionary process that we're involved in because we are so ignorant. War is ignorance and stupidity at its most destructive. But what about the war inside of ourselves? The war in our relationships that we wage? That is also an effect of separation and ignorance that creates a collective outcome.
And we do create so much suffering for ourselves. And it really is out of our own ignorance and our lack of understanding. And since we're talking about suffering and pain being part of the evolutionary process, then they are either a bridge, the evolutionary bridge to another world, or we're just doomed to stay stuck in these cycles of suffering, of overwhelm, of feeling like we're being choked. We're just doomed to stay there forever if we can't view these difficulties, even traumas and atrocities, as bridges into an evolutionary progression of moving ahead.
Each night on the news, we are witness to the exploitation of the world's suffering for individual greed.
Mhm.
We witness genocide and the denial of suffering of others. And yes, I'm talking about the United States. What do we have to learn? What do we have to do to grow beyond this? Because if we don't, like you said, we're doomed to repeat whatever it is, what we haven't learned as a collective, as a species. But while there is so much darkness, there is also something else. And that something else is reality. If all there is God, if all there is the divine, the reality, the absolute, the eternal, then what that means is that the darkness is but a tool of that reality to move itself forward in the evolutionary process, essentially to reveal itself.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing, Hayden, to acknowledge or come to terms with the idea that even the tyrant or the murderer or those who start wars, in some cosmic sense, that they're tools of the divine to force humanity toward change. I mean, even the Holocaust that my friend was speaking about, but I'm aware that difficulty and catastrophe and of course, darkness, they do force us to examine who we are. And me in my individual life, that tends to be when I go in and have the most reflection, is when times are difficult. And there is that kind of cause and effect. And I think about the profound, really paradox of World War II, which shows that extreme suffering can act as really a violent catalyst for human beings to excel, for their ingenuity to really speed up. So essentially, while the suffering, of course, is tragic, and we'll talk about also it's not necessary, there's another way, but it did break the kind of status quo and accelerated progress that might have otherwise taken much longer, even centuries, to achieve.
Well, the important thing is to understand we do not have to learn that way.
Yeah.
But as long as we remain ignorant and closed within the mind, then that's what's going to happen. It's going to continue.
Well, this quote from the mother has brought me a great deal of peace over the last few years, and I want to share it with everybody today. So, this quote from the mother has helped me when I start to feel overwhelmed with all of the difficulties and suffering in the world today. And just as a point of reference, the mother died in 1973, and she was born in the late 1800s. So her time frame really was World War II when she was writing and
Very
living,
much
and
so.
so a lot of her references, are about that. So here's the quote I want to share. "Each time a wave of these monstrous adverse forces sweeps over the earth, one feels that nothing can ever stop the disorder and horror from spreading. And always at a certain time, unexpectedly and inexplicably, a control intervenes and the wave is arrested. The catastrophe is not total. And this is because of the presence, the supreme presence in matter."
I I think that'd be a great T-shirt. The catastrophe is not total,
At least a
and the
bumper sticker.
catastrophe is not going to be total.
Yeah, there's so much evidence of that. There was a veteran at the office last week, and politics came up, as sometimes will, and he referred to a current political figure as evil. But then he said, "But I don't think he is irredeemable." And now I just wanna go back to the mother. She said, and this is a quote, "Even in the most monstrous human being, there is something within exercising a sort of irresistible control. Even in the worst, some things are impossible." And everyone is redeemable. This is me speaking, not the mother, because everyone, like it or not, is a spark of the divine.
Well,
Sometimes it's hard to remember that.
redemption is real, but it may not take place in this lifetime.
Mm.
That's the thing. There are so many, going back to something you said earlier, invisible forces that are playing out in our life that we have very little understanding of. What I find so fascinating, keeping this at an individual level, what I find so fascinating in myself is watch myself be confronted with the murder of essentially 170 kids in a school that has just been bombed to oblivion, with the deaths of elementary school students whose bodies were blown to pieces at the hands of demented individuals over and over and over again in a country that refuses to enact gun laws. And the examples of this are, of course, are endless. But what I find so fascinating in myself as I watch myself be confronted with this insanity is that my first unchecked impulse is to do the same, to kill, to erase, to rid the world of these incompetent, immoral individuals. And of course, I in doing that, you only perpetuate the problem in the first place. It doesn't
But
solve
it does
anything.
help me understand. I mean, who wouldn't if your child was killed in any way, but such a horrific way that you would want to get revenge? Or when yeah, I mean, there's so
It's
many examples of that, even countries getting revenge on other countries.
still
It's
doing it
never
today.
ending, though.
Well, in other words, what I'm saying is my first unconscious reaction to violence is violence.
Mm.
Now, I think that there's a lot of that that comes from my previous lifetime. I do feel that way because of what my previous lifetime was about.
Not to
But
mention your childhood of this
right,
lifetime.
exactly. But engaging in wrong to stop wrong never corrects wrong. And of course, I don't think I've done that in this lifetime, but I am aware that that is my first impulse. Meet resistance with resistance, which is just another form of insanity. So it's easy for me to acknowledge about myself that as a result of that, I'm aware that I'm so immature
Mm.
in some ways. I am mature in some ways, and I'm aware that I am evolved in some ways. But the immaturity is there, and it's there for each one
It's
of
like the
us.
mother says, "Your perfection is not yet
Not
complete." I love
right.
that.
So I want to go ahead and point this out that years ago, when I was shown the answer to this problem of how to bear the unbearable, of how is it that everything is okay, of how to face difficulty and hardship, it was the one answer that I could not accept at that
Well, and
time.
that's, when you don't get when things go horrifically wrong or they don't go your way, it's really hard for the answer to be, "But everything's happening for a reason," or "Let go," or, "Here's the answer to it," and it doesn't fit what my ego wants to do. Like you just said, resistance meets resistance. How can I turn the other cheek, so to speak?
Well, as time has gone by, I think I've made a lot of progress, but I'm not 100% there. But, I want to be. And this is the essence of how to learn to bear the unbearable. And notice I did not give the answer to that problem. Well, I'll come up to that in just a
Yeah.
little bit. But the answer to that problem is a characteristic of the cosmic unfolding itself. And so we'll get to that.
So the bombings, the shootings, the wars, they aren't the cause. They are the symptoms, and like so many aspects of life, we treat only the symptoms and not the cause. I was talking to a young woman the other day about a problem she was having at work, and actually a relationship at work, and it was all about the symptoms, but when you get to understand the cause of it, then we can start making progress, but the mind really loves, grinding away on the on the content, on the he said, she said, and he did and she did, without ever understanding kind of the bigger picture, the context. But unless the context becomes not only the reference point, but also the solution, there's really not much that we can solve. We just stay in our closed tape loop of feeling overwhelmed or feeling dissed in some way.
Well, it's a great scene in, I'm having a brain freeze. What's the horse movie? A
Seabiscuit?
Seabiscuit, yeah. It's a
There.
great scene in Seabiscuit where the horse's owner is speaking to the rider, his name
Red.
is Red,
Yeah.
who, got really upset in the middle of a race and, uh went into his impulses, did not follow the plan. They lost the race,
But he
and
did get to cuss out the other rider,
right,
which
but
was what he wanted to do.
right,
Yeah,
and so in the process, he lost the race,
yeah.
and the owner is looking at me, and he said, "But I thought we had a plan." And Red yells out loud, "But he fouled me."
What am I supposed to do?
What
He
if
found me.
he fouled me? And the owner looks at him and says, Why are you so mad?" Like,
Mhm.
it's not because he fouled you, and it's not because of how I was mistreated, and it's not because but it feels that way, and I understand that, but these times are about learning to grow beyond that.
I think the solutions are simpler than the symptoms. They're simpler than we're aware of. It's the mind, it's the unconsciousness, the ignorance that prevents us from seeing the simplicity of it. We're so busy being fouled or having our boss be disrespectful by being late for a meeting. That's for a person who's hell bent on a particular way of seeing the world or themselves, like I'm disrespectable, then we'll never see it. We'll never be able to move past the
Well,
content.
this is the turning point that we're all involved in the world today, and that is coming our way in the future. Suffering is not the cause of suffering. Addiction is not the cause of addiction. Suffering is not a necessity. But if you think it is and you argue for violence in order to end violence, and then that's what you'll do. And then you'll turn around and justify why you had to bomb a people into submission because there was no other way. And doing so, you produce the future bombers
Right.
of the world. For energy attracts like energy, vibration attracts like vibration. War begets war, hate begets hate. People with guns attract people with guns, but generosity begets generosity. Love begets love. Transformation begets more transformation.
There better be, because in today's world, we're really being forced to bear the unbearable, and because we're here in the middle of this mess, I've come to believe and understand it must be because we're supposed to be here, and I know this is true, and it might sound strange to you listening, but the soul is chosen, your soul is chosen to be here at this time, just as there are children being born today who will grow up and play a role in the transformation when they're older that lies ahead. So, unconsciousness and kind of the current condition of mankind is not the end product. We have not finished evolving. We didn't come here as fully finished human beings. That the product of our existence is much more than what we can even imagine it to be. School shootings, for example, have inspired people like David Hogg from Parkland High School in Florida to become an activist for gun reform. Zip tying immigrant children is, in a certain way, its own executioner of that practice by forcing souls to suffer. The act of violence really instills in them strength to eventually destroy the violence that created their suffering, not through more violence, but through the power of love. It's why we're here. Because while the unbearable is part of our world, we are here to transcend the need, the default, the practice of using suffering as a way to
Well,
evolve.
that's the foundation. The unbearable or loss or suffering of any kind is not a necessity of the world, but it certainly appears to be the preferred mechanism of growth and awakening.
Well, it's kinda like after World War II, we had these allies all these years, so we'll take steps forward, and now we're taking a step backward, but it won't be all the way back.
Well, the catastrophe is not going to be total.
Yeah.
Going back to the quote, the lower the consciousness, the higher the use of violence. And this must become our focus. How do I evolve? How do I become more conscious? Because that's the only thing, a radical shift of consciousness, that it can eliminate the need for violence to solve our problems. It's only with the spiritual as the basis of not believing, but knowing that everything is unfolding exactly as it should, that it is governed by the divine, that we stand a chance of exceeding the mind's limited perceptual fields that result in so much pain and suffering. But at the same time, it is heartbreaking. And there's that duality of existence that I referred to earlier. And here's the answer that I was shown many years ago that I could not accept. It is a certain impersonal, a certain indifference to that unfolding. Indifference? I've said to myself, how's that possible? That was what I could not understand at the time, but as the years have passed, I have become more indifferent, but for a different reason because I realized that there was a synonym that was associated with indifference, and that synonym is equality. Once I understood that, it was like the path was it was laid out in front of me. It's not that you don't care. What I would find is that the indifference or the equality, that is seeing that the negative is a tool of the positive, that the negative is working at the directions of the positive. I would find that it really started sharpening my focus, that it heightened my resolve to come to terms with those things, to widen my willingness to bear the unbearable, because at last I understood its purpose.
And if I can I interrupt for just a second to make sure? So indifference, the way you're talking about it, is it about preferences? Like, I'm indifferent to how it goes because the equality piece is if it doesn't go my way this time, it just means there's something else that I'm learning from this or something else coming down the road or this wasn't meant to be. Is that what you mean
Well,
by indifference?
yes, but the very fact that an individual in today's world, when confronted with a difficulty or a suffering, whether it is of your own or it is a suffering of someone that you love, the fact that you could even stop and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this, is magnificent.
Yeah.
Because maybe you don't know what the purpose is, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And
Rather than
everything,
being in resistance to what's happening,
right,
ask, "Why is
that's
this?"
not going to change
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
Everything and everybody grows toward the light. And why? Because the light or God is all there is. The light is your source of being. And if you can accept this, then you can say that everything is okay. Because if anything is happening that is not supposed to be happening, then it is a negation of the source itself. You will notice with great accuracy that everything is allowed, including murder, including starvation. But you'll notice with great clarity that not everything is accepted. Darkness eventually dies away. All dictators eventually die or are removed. And yeah, it can take some time, but all wars come to an end.
It's like
Personal hardships do not last forever. How long they last is dependent upon how you view them, how you see them, whether you understand its purpose.
you just made me think of a time we didn't get a contract that we totally expected to get, for work, and when we got the news that we weren't awarded that contract, you were out of town. I went home, I got in bed, I pulled the covers up literally over my head. I'm like, "I don't wanna play anymore."
I'm going to die.
I was not, I'll say this, I was not indifferent.
Well, if you look at the opposite of the suffering, that is, of indifference, of simply being the observer, observing without any expectations, but with equality, which is a lifelong process to learn, the opposite is the feeling of being completely annihilated or
Mhm.
overwhelmed, consumed by the loss or the suffering, the injustice of what it is that happened. And, that I think that's kind of a normal impulse. One of the most difficult things I ever had to go through in my life that I saw is so unjust when it was happening turned out to be one of the greatest things that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
So it's going to turn out every individual must be able to admit to themselves that lots of times the things that I really fought for, really wanted, turned out to be bad for me. The opposite is also true, that every individual must get to a point that you can admit that the difficulty or the hardship that you face was actually tied to a significant opportunity. It was just going to take time for it to arise. There's so much in our own backyards that we can utilize to make progress, like when the dog eats the steak off the counter, which
You had
is
to bring that up.
which is what our dog did the other night when the dealership changing the oil in your car backs your car into another car. And that's what
Yeah, it
our
happened too.
dealership did with our car. I mean, do you want me to keep going? Because there's so much in our everyday life of raising kids, paying the bills, moving through the fear and the upset of everyday life. And I know this may sound crazy, but in the midst of all that, to see, as difficult as it is, the privilege of bearing the unbearable, the privilege of being able to take this on in your life that is going to increase your willingness and ability to deal with difficulty, to transform the unbearable, and lessen the need to keep choosing pain and suffering as a way to evolve. So, is the unbearable necessary? No. But we keep choosing it because we're trapped in our minds, which houses our preferences, expectations, fears, worries, etc.
And our identity that's wrapped up in the wrong thing.
So we can choose to learn through the opposite of that, which is through expansion and transformation. And that's going to be a little scary too, but that's a good fear to
Right.
be dealing with.
You know, I first thought indifference, Hayden, when we first started exploring that, was apathy. But what I now know is it's really centered around developing this inner poise of being able to move to center that prevents you, at least slows down the need to access your lower emotional nature, the one that snaps at the person you love most, or the one that rolls your eyes, the one that gets overwhelmed, afraid, the one that kind of moves into despair and suffering. I've gotten much better in that, but it does take discipline and a more conscious approach to facing hardship and difficulty. And again, not there are the daily ones that we practice and that help us put this energy into the world of being centered, the inner poise, the strength, but there are also the really big things that we see that feel like we have no control over. But certainly anyone can see the freedom that results in having the skill of moving into center, of having an inner poise, of being unthreatenable. And it's not about just being numb or kind of sunny side up. It feels more like conquering those lower parts of me that create the suffering in the first place, the fear, the despair, the feeling less than. And why add more wind to the storm that's already out there through my own self doubt and my own worry and upset? And the other thing that's become so important to me is the extent to which even a moment, just one moment of clarity, one moment spent in inner poise or in indifference or equality creates a whole different identity for me. It's a much stronger experience of myself, knowing I have the power to face the difficulty. That is part of the value of the suffering. Whatever doesn't kill you, makes you stronger, right?
Well, we were having lunch in that cafe the other day and asked you to turn around and read the sign in the back. And we live in East Asheville, where 80% of the black bears in the county in which we live in East Asheville because of the geography here. And there was a sign in the cafe that said, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, except for bears. Bears will kill you.
Nice, sweet bears. I love our
you
bears.
know,
Yeah.
but that actually is true. You see, underneath, speaking about the invisible forces and the balance, that unstable equilibrium, you are never given a problem for which you do not have the ability to solve. How unjust that would be. That would be so unfair to be given a task, a curriculum that you are incapable
Hmm.
of mastering, but everything is in balance.
And the difficulty doesn't have to define me, when I when I lose it, I don't do that very often anymore, but when I get upset, it does create an unstable identity. I get separated from the truth of who I am. I get stuck out on the periphery and the content, and it's hard to get back to center. I can be kind of swirling out there on the edge and not feeling much balance at all.
Well, let's dig down here a little bit and let's go into spiritual principle and concept here in terms of this issue of being in a physical body
Mm.
on the planet. The thousands of years ago, the concept of detachment really began in Buddhism, which was my first introduction essentially to spirituality when I was very young. But I would ask myself, but detachment for what reason? The old spiritual concepts, which served their purpose, were really about rejecting the physical and reaching nirvana, or you could say, to simplify this, of reaching heaven. Now, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm just going to heaven.
I'm just
But
going to get in my bed and pull the covers up over
right,
my head.
exactly. Give me a Pepsi, you know. But the concept of indifference or equality is about transforming the physical. And that's why we're here. So to me, from a spiritual point of view, it's very important to point out the difference between these older concepts of detachment and this issue of equality or indifference. Um, as I said, indifference is synonymous with
It's
equality.
like
The
you
negative
said.
is serving the positive, and that equality results in peace and power, in freedom of so many different kinds, and in transformation. It is true that your suffering is serving a greater cause, but once you realize that, why would you keep choosing suffering? You can choose to learn through expansion, as I said, and love and exceeding your current circumstances, and that's going to scare you too. What if I fail? What if I run out of money? What if I'm just dreaming, and that what it is that I want to do is going to result in me losing everything? Well, that's going to keep you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but that's a good inconvenience. That's a good fear. That's called conscious growth.
So everything's okay.
No, everything is not okay. Everything is perfect. And I mean that. But your mind's not going to agree with you. You have to learn to see what your eyes cannot see. There's the personal side of God, but there's also the impersonal side of God. In reality, death is not real. Darkness is not real, because darkness is just a perversion of the light. Death is the beginning of a new adventure as the soul journeys from one lifetime to the next. Everything is evolving exactly as it should, and at the exact same time, it is unbearable and heartbreaking. When we succumb to the darkness, we have become, I love this line from, I don't remember where I read this, but I always remember the line. We become the meat at the monster's feast. In other words, we're fodder for,
Yeah.
the process. But when we move within and we have the courage to embrace the hardships of our lives, we transform not only the hardship itself, but the quality and the nature of the opportunity that will arise out of that hardship. The more you see, the more you become.
It's also recognizing, Hayden, that the soul can choose hardship. The soul can choose suffering because it knows it is unthreatenable. It's me, the person, the ego, the individual that forgets that sometimes. And I see that life is this dynamic process of the hidden truth, or for example, that the soul could choose these difficulties in life, that reveals itself through this struggle of my evolving, of evolution. Suffering is a kind of evolutionary engine, so to speak, that forces us to grow. Ignorance, or the absence of spiritual understanding, results in division, not only in myself, but from each other, from one another. But alignment with the spiritual, with the divine, with even spiritual principles, dissolves that division. And we see that we are all one. The individual begins to wake up, and that has so much impact and effect on the world. Ignorance is not replaced. Um, I know this sounds impossible, but ignorance is not replaced, but it's dissolved in the same way, like windshield wipers clear the view, clear the rain off so we can see the road that was always there. It was just murky because there was so much rain on the windshield. True transformation is a result of spiritual realization.
Spiritual knowledge is a result of being, not doing. It's not doing that creates the growth, it's being. And where does that begin? Well, you have to learn to see what your eyes cannot see. See the perfection of your being. See the perfection in others that they cannot see in themselves. See the perfection in the world as it grows to the light. See God in everything, including the stupidity and the ignorance of the world, because what you see is what you be. You know the truth because you are the truth that was contained in you at birth, a living physical example of God, of the divine, on your own unique evolutionary path to realizing that truth. No, as I said, no individual is given a problem that they don't have the ability to face. So here's
Because
the
the soul chose
equilibrium.
it in the first place.
The soul chose it in the first place. See, if you didn't choose it, if you did not have a role in bringing that difficulty towards you, then we can't make sense out of any of this. The hardship that you face is mathematically proportional to the opportunity that awaits you if you can but see it and have the ability to move to center.
So, as we wrap up today's conversation, we want to leave you with a different way to look at the unbearable things in your life. We aren't asking you to pretend that pain doesn't hurt or that the world isn't messy. We're asking you to look through the mess and the screwed upness to the perfection that is unfolding.
That you have a choice. You could be I'll go back to the statement, the meat at the monster's feast, consumed by the darkness, or you can be the observer, just standing in that quiet, powerful center of spiritual equality.
And strength.
And I didn't say it's easy, but it is the path. It is the way. I may say it's not easy, but suffering is hard. This other is so relieving in so many
And there's
ways.
freedom and strength
So
in it.
much.
If this conversation has resonated with you and you'd like to move from just understanding these principles to living them, we would love to have you join us in person. And there's several ways to do that. We're hosting an upcoming workshop at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, July 31st to August 2nd.
You can find all the registration details in the show notes here or on our website at truespringasheville.com.
You are not your past traumas. You are not your boss's feedback. You are not your fears, but you are a spark of the divine on a unique journey toward the light. And as we've seen today, sometimes the very things that try to batter and break us are the things that finally reveal that which is indestructible in us. Thank you so much for joining us on Becoming You, the Path to Consciousness. We look forward to seeing many of you at Omega this summer. Hope you'll also consider joining our online community, Becoming You Journey.
Remember that everything is evolving exactly as it should, as heartbreaking as it is, and that everything is not just okay. In fact, it's perfect. It's okay. The mind can't get this, but the higher part of your being can, because it is the process. Everything is going to be okay.
And Haydn and I wanted to end with this quote from Carl Fried Graf Durkheim's book, The Way of Transformation. The person who is really on the way does not seek a surcease from pain and a comfortable life. On the contrary, their practice should teach them to let themselves be assaulted, perturbed, moved, insulted, broken, and battered. This is to say, it should enable them to let go their futile hankering after harmony, in order that they may discover, in doing battle with the forces that seem to threaten them, that which is indestructible within them.
I love that quote. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care and have a wonderful week.